Good evening, good afternoon, Frank.
Hi, Brian.
I was thinking earlier today, reading the news, that most people, when they talk about globalization, are concerned with what's going on economically, and it's not very often that people talk about what's going on politically that suggests globalization. Mm-hmm. And there aren't really very many other dimensions to globalization as it appears in the news. But a number of things have been happening recently that makes one wonder whether we will ever have a global idea of justice. And maybe that's the most difficult thing to work out. But will we ever have true globalization if we don't have a global justice system? I mean, the obvious things that have happened recently, well, one thing has been in everybody's headlines. I don't think anybody could have avoided it over the last week, which is this young woman, young female student in the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan who was shot for supporting the idea of education for girls. And she had a record of doing this sort of thing, and the Taliban finally decided they'd had enough, and they just had to get rid of her. And when you've had enough of somebody and you want to get rid of them, that's where you get rid of them. You shoot them in the head. And she survived. And we don't yet know whether her medical problems are the same as that congresswoman's problems in Arizona a year ago.
Congressman Giffords.
And just exactly to what extent she will recover, but the news continues to be promising that maybe she will recover. And of course, if she does, she's going to be an amazing symbol for women's rights. But even though it's often said that a good cause needs a good martyr, I think martyrs often get forgotten, whereas somebody who actually survives an attack like this may be very important for what happens next. However, is there much chance at the moment of there ever being a global agreement on justice for that sort of act?
I think if I could just jump in, I think that actually this is very interesting. We've been discussing globalization for quite some time. We've been discussing it in terms of economic issues. We've been discussing it in terms of social issues. We've been discussing it in terms of rate of change, insurance issues, go right down the list. And to my memory, this is the first time we've discussed it in terms of judicial/legal issues. And it's interesting because one of the first things you learn in law school, and I did go to law school, is that the law is a reflection of the society. All right, there's no two ways around that. And in fact, the law to be effective needs to be organic, which is supposedly the purpose of the Supreme Court, so it can evolve and change as society changes. Now, I would suggest that there are, in fact, sectors within the Sharia judicial system, if you will, that are applauding what happened to this poor young woman in the Swat Valley. So in one respect, there is a group of society, albeit a subset, that has seen its law meted out in exactly the fashion they would have desired. And when we talk about trying to get a standardized judicial system, or at least an agreement on things that should be legal or not legal, we're really talking about something much bigger. We're talking about almost a common sort of empathy, a common sort of empathetic or social mores that has to exist, and that's a very big challenge.
It's difficult to see how the cultural differences in what people consider to be normal everyday rights can ever coalesce to the point where you would have a justice system so that somebody who was under attack for some sort of crime in one place couldn't escape to another part of the world where they wouldn't be considered to be criminal in the same sense. One of the reasons that I decided to bring this up today in particular was not because of the horrific nature of what happened in Swat, but what happened earlier today or yesterday in England when David Cameron suggested that he might not go along with the latest European idea about a European justice system.
Right, right. The European arrest warrant
Yes.
initiative, yeah.
Which it just shows you how sensitive this whole thing is. That if England can't agree with the European community on an arrest warrant, then what are the chances of anything approaching globalization when it comes to something that has to do, well, we think of it as morals. But I think putting the term morality on it makes it more difficult to talk about it.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And we probably should avoid the term morality and think of it in terms of social order. How we have social order without agreement on what constitutes order.
Well, I think that that's critical, all right, because I think, for example, if you look at what happened in Pakistan, I mean, officially the Pakistani government is on the record as abhorring what happened to that young woman. All right, so what they're saying is that this was a social subset, almost a tribal kind of thing that caused this action. Yet in Britain, this is almost a national sovereignty issue that is going on. And yet again, there's something else that's very interesting. This is never said. It's never said in any of the presidential debates, because it would outrage the Chinese. Is that the reason that the United States is frankly not unbelievably worried about the Chinese is because international investment will continue to come into the United States for one simple reason, and that is the absolute certainty of the rule of law, which does not exist in China. There is no certainty there insofar as the rule of law goes. And that is something that, from a business perspective, just can't be overlooked. I mean, you have to be able to understand what the reactions are going to be officially.
But you know what Steve Jobs told President Obama?
About the jobs and being able to set up a factory in China in 2 months, et cetera, et cetera.
That he's going to set his factory up in China because he can do it in 3 months there, and it'll take 3 years here, or words, something like that.
Right.
I wonder, actually, because there are problems everywhere, and after all, finance is risk, and the legal security is not the only risk that financiers have to be concerned with in deciding what to do with their resources. I mean, that's just a suggestion, but I know we place enormous value on the rule of law, and assume that it's something we have in a much more advanced degree than anybody else has. But that may not continue to be the sort of advantage that we have always assumed it should be.
Well, let's look at that now. All right, since you raised it, all right. The Sharia law has been in existence much longer than the Western law, if you will, certainly much longer than the United States law. It probably is at least as certain and as predictable. All right, it's probably codified to a much greater extent than the American Constitution and all the existing case law. And it is probably the case that one could set up a business in an Islamic country and be completely cognizant and mindful and observant of every single law that might exist regarding tackle companies or any sort of commerce or business that needs to be followed, and never be bothered again, forever and ever, amen. But once that operation begins to function outside of that border unit and begins to function somewhere else, they're either going to be at a disadvantage or they're going to be breaking the law in some other jurisdiction.
Islamic law is unchangeable and is a system. It was revealed, or at least was put together from things that were revealed, and has a history of commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries that goes back nearly 1,500 years.
These are the hadiths.
It's scholars' commentaries on the law. I mean, sources of the law are the hadith and the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. But the focus of the law is either family law, which doesn't concern us so much at the moment, or contract law. contract is the central idea in Islamic law. However, because of the way the society works, there is the idea of a corporation as a fictive legal identity that is free to operate according to contract anywhere in Islamic society doesn't work as well as it does here. And here we've got a problem between, freedom of speech now, whether a fictive legal identity should have the same freedom of speech as a real person.
Yes.
I mean, and why should I be responsible for why should if a corporation can have limited liability, why can't I have limited liability? So we've got these problems as well, but in the Islamic situation, it's more complicated because the society works in such a way that everything depends upon relationships between families. Mm-hmm. And the law is something that's appealed to when the relationships between families don't work properly. Mm-hmm. Whereas here we claim that law is primary and the other things get appealed to only in certain situations when you want to somehow try to get around the law.
Well, I guess what I've been struck by is despite the justification that the Taliban has used, religious justification of extreme Sharia observance regarding this attack, I've been very struck by the outpouring, the globalizationally empowered outpouring that has been seen in the Islamic world on behalf of this young woman. All right, on the part of young people everywhere, on the part of leaders, on the part of just regular Islamic citizens who have got access to the internet. It seems as if something different is occurring, that it's almost a kind of embracing of her and embracing of what she was doing and embracing her cause almost to the exclusion of what the Taliban was trying to do. It may end up backfiring.
Because most Muslims are like us, that they don't think shooting 14-year-old girls is a good idea.
Right.
And the reason the Taliban do it is that the Taliban are desperate to defend an old way of life against foreign influence. Because of the rate of social change that is a result of recent foreign influence is disrupting their society. They don't really remember what their society used to be like, so they're idealizing the past, and that's what's leading them to this extreme behavior. So this is a stage they're going through, and I don't think it wasn't like this 100 years ago. I don't think the same thing would have happened 100 years ago, and I don't think it will happen 50 years from now. It's just a part of the resistance to change because of the accelerated current change that we have to put up with.
That's a very interesting observation, actually, because if what they're doing and have been doing for the past 10 years or so is a reaction to the rate of change, then you're right. That obviously this action or reaction is going to have to change eventually as they either become acclimated or they die off naturally, and people succeed them who are acclimated to the rate of change, and there will be a difference in their actions.
Anyway, the Sharia is based on a text. Canonical law in the Catholic Church is essentially based on texts. There were other types of law in Europe that were based on texts. Anglo-Saxon law is based on precedent, so it can change easily. American law is somehow some sort of compromise between the two.
Right.
It's based on precedent as long as you can argue from the text to the precedent. It looks as though if there's any hope for the legal situation in a world that continues to move in the direction of globalization, there's going to have to be a new idea of how law is developed, because there's no way that we're going to have the precedent is going to work properly as law for 10 billion people.
No.
It's good for small communities, but not for ultra large communities. And that any text you start from is culturally construed in the first place. So we're going to have what we need is for our international lawyers to come up with a new recipe for a foundation for law, a legal foundation.
Well, that can be done, I'm sure, to get 50 wise men in a room, wise men and women, and do that. But it's going to have to track back to what the social acceptability is at the root level for certain offenses. So it's a difficult challenge.
And I suppose that that may be the most likely basis for putting together some sort of global forum.
Mm-hmm.
And we would stand a much better chance of putting together a global forum if it had that objective in its planning, as distinct from the idea of a global government.
Oh yeah, I would think so. I would think so.
Which, of course, we're not actively trying to do at the moment, but people generally seem to assume that if we're going to have a united world, there has to be a central government.
Mm-hmm.
But there does have to be a central, a generally acceptable basis for public order.
Do you think Britain will ever leave the EU?
You really want to finish on a question like that?
I don't think they dare.
I think that the European Union will not continue to be exactly what it is now, and I think England, whether or not Scotland remains in it, will not continue to be exactly the same as it is now. And I think it will always be closely related to Europe. But whether it will be called a part of the European Union or not, I'm not going to risk making a bet on.
Okay. Well, very good, Professor. Thank you very much for your time today.
See you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.